To kind of set the tone, can you tell us the story about the erroneous evidence that you watched influence the creation of a law in the UK?
Certainly. So in 2016, there was a UK inquiry into corporate governance, which is the way that companies are run. And being a professor who studies corporate governance, I submitted some written evidence in response. They invited me to give all evidence in front of the UK House of Commons. It's in front of a select committee. And so I was grilled with some questions. But before my session, there was a session beforehand, which I sat in on just to make sure I knew what was going on. And the witness before me mentioned some research which sounded quite noteworthy. So she said that there was evidence which suggested the lower the gap between the CEO's pay and the worker pay, the better the company's performance. And this was really interesting to me because some of my own research is about the merits of treating employees fairly. So I thought this would be another bow to my arrow, so I might just tweet it from the rooftops and share it with other people. So I wanted to find out this research so I could share it. And I looked up the study because it was in the witness's written submission, and it said completely the opposite. It said the lower the pay gap, the worse the performance rather than the better. And I thought, well, yeah, I am pretty nervous before my own session, but clearly I should know how to read, and it was there as clear as day. And I realized what had happened is the witness had quoted a half-finished version of the study. So I was looking at the finished version. The finished version showed the lower the pay gap, the worse the performance. But the witness quoted the half-finished version because it gave what it wanted to be true. The witness was from the trade union with a strong public position against pay gaps, and so it wanted to quote evidence finding that pay gaps are bad for performance.
That's wild. And then that made its way through into the law though? Like how did the rest of the process work?
So what happens is that there's lots of witnesses who give evidence at the select committee. You would not necessarily make law based on one particular witness statement. And indeed, after finding this out, I reported this to the clerk of the select committee. He said, oh, this is not good. You should write some more evidence in. We will publish it. And they did. And yet they ignored my rebuttal. It's not so much a rebuttal, it was a clarification. They still went ahead by quoting the original evidence as if it was gospel. And this was really alarming to me because, okay, you think, yes, there's misinformation. Maybe somebody on Breitbart News or an Instagram influencer will spread misinformation. But the UK House of Commons Select Committee, for something that might eventually become law, was quoting something they knew to be wrong. So sometimes we're misinformed because we can't look at every single information out there. But I had informed them, I had sent my clarification, they had published it, yet this was something they didn't want to be true. Why? Because the UK at the time, there was quite a lot of outrage against high CEO pay. That was the reason for having this inquiry to begin with. So they just latched onto evidence they knew was incorrect. And eventually it now became law that every company in the UK above a certain threshold has to publish pay ratios. Now, the point here is not about pay ratios being good or bad. Different people might have different opinions, but just how careful we need to be about evidence, and even evidence from a supposedly trusted source, like a UK government report, may well not be gospel.
Yeah, that's pretty scary stuff. Yeah, what does it mean to say that we live in a post-truth world?
It is that there's lots of misinformation out there. And you might think, well, this is obvious. I knew this before listening to this podcast. But what I want to highlight is misinformation is a bigger problem than what we think. So we think that misinformation might be an outright lie. So if somebody claims that Barack Obama is not a natural born US citizen, we can falsify that by showing his passport. But sometimes something could be truthful, but it could still be misleading. So indeed, it was true that one version of that paper had found that low pay gaps are linked to better performance, and they indeed quoted that half-finished version of the paper. So the witness cannot be prosecuted for spreading misinformation because what they said was strictly true. That earlier version did find that result, but they had forgotten or they completely failed to recognize that there was a later version, a finished version, after going through peer review and correcting its mistakes, which found the opposite. So we can be misled even by truth. So post-truth does not mean just outright lies. It might be things that are truthful, but are misleading because they've been superseded.
It shows up in that story that you just told. Can you talk more generally about the role that confirmation bias plays in making it difficult for people to find the truth?
So you might think, well, misinformation, that just happens to uninformed people. I'm a smart listener to this podcast, I'm rational, and therefore I won't fall for this misinformation. But what I'm highlighting is that many people, including me, make these mistakes. In the book, I go through examples where I myself made mistakes. It's not that we're bad people, it's that we're people. And if we're people, we have biases. And one of the biases, as you mentioned, Ben, is confirmation bias. So that's the idea that we have a view of the world, and if we see something that supports that viewpoint, we lap it up uncritically. So maybe the trade union had a view that high pay gaps are bad, low pay gaps are good. As soon as they saw a paper that supports that, which confirmed their viewpoint, they lapped it up. They didn't even bother to look at whether that paper was updated, even though it was 2016. They looked at a 2010 version. The finished version that I looked at was in 2013, so it'd been out for 3 years, but there was no need to look for it if you already have the answer that you want.
What should people do to combat confirmation bias when they're making a decision themselves?
I think it's like any sort of addiction, which is to recognize that you have the addiction to begin with. So the first step towards alcohol recovery is to know that you have a problem. Now, the listeners might think, well, that's a pretty strong statement to compare bias to an addiction. But I don't think it's strong because it has the same roots, and those roots are psychological. So we are actually addicted to seeing things that confirm what we like to be true. So there have been neurological studies which show that when you see something that confirms your viewpoint, it releases dopamine in your body. It feels as good as finishing a long run or having a laugh with friends. Yet when we see something we don't like, it triggers the amygdala, and that is the part of the brain that induces a fight or flight response. It's the part that's triggered when we're attacked by a tiger. So just to recognize that we naturally have a preference towards listening to things that we will like and shutting out things that we don't, then we will need to actively combat this by going out and reading things that we won't agree with. So this might be reading articles from a newspaper with a different political viewpoint. It may well be in a meeting, encouraging people to disagree with me, giving time and space for people to share dissenting opinions. Any active action that we can take, having recognized that we will naturally gravitate only towards confirming viewpoints, is a way of getting more informed.
You have like a toolkit at the end of the book that one of the things that you wrote there that stuck with me was to ask yourself if you want the thing that you're looking at to be true as a filter to see whether you may be affected by confirmation bias.
Yeah, and I think this is important because when I'm trying to lead the reader to smarter thinking, but I need to recognize that the reader doesn't have the time to check every single footnote in every single paper. So where can we be selective and apply the 80-20 principle if there is a study or a claim on something that's number one, important, and number two, that we really want to be true, then we need to be particularly careful. Why? Because number one, we might not scrutinize it. But number two, other people haven't scrutinized it. Why we might have heard of that study is it's been round our echo chamber. Other people have liked it and shared it without necessarily checking it just because they like the punchline.
Empirically, how severe are the effects of confirmation bias?
They're very severe. So what studies have done is, in addition to looking at how this affects the brain, is the neurological basis, is they've looked at how it affects outcomes. And perhaps one really serious outcome is false conviction. So there were studies of the most serious investigative failures. And what the study looked at is what were the various causes of this. Maybe the DNA evidence was incorrect, but the clear winner by some margin was confirmation bias. So what does this mean in a criminal investigation setting? You might have a hunch about who is guilty. Maybe that's somebody with a particular appearance. Sadly, it can be somebody with a particular ethnicity or other demographic characteristics, or they may have visible markings like tattoos, which you use as a stereotype. And then every piece of evidence you interpret as consistent with that suspect. But what I highlight in the book, in all settings, not just criminal settings, but with evidence, is that there's multiple explanations for a finding. So if I find more sustainable companies perform better, a sustainability advocate like me will claim its sustainability causes better performance, but alternative explanations is that better performance could cause sustainability. And similarly, in a criminal investigation, it may well be that there's a forensic evidence that the killer was a 5'10" male. Sorry, not forensic evidence, eyewitness evidence that the killer was a 5'10" white male, and that is fitting your suspect. But it could also fit other people who were in the vicinity, they had motive, means, and opportunity, but you don't explore those alternative suspects because you're just narrowly framing on your particular culprit.
Yeah, something that I've definitely noticed is that on divisive issues, people will generally agree on the facts, but they may disagree severely on the way to interpret the facts.
Absolutely, there's very selective interpretation. So if there is a study which finds that sustainability doesn't pay off, then on LinkedIn, there's no shortage of comments as to this is one study out of many, or maybe this was just in a particular time period. And yet when there is a study finding sustainability does pay off, then people will just shout this from the rooftops without considering the fact this is just one study. So we know how to be discerning and critical, but we are doing this very selectively. We criticize things that we don't like. But what I'm highlighting is we need to apply the same discernment to things that we do like. And why I think this is quite realistic for even busy people to do is what this highlights is that the skills for discernment are already within us. So if the solution to misinformation is for everybody to get a PhD in statistics, that's clearly unrealistic. I don't even have one myself. But if instead we already know not to overweight one single study, we know that correlation is not causation, we know that a cherry-picked anecdote may not be representative, apply those same checks when we see something that we do like.
How impactful is biased search as opposed to biased interpretation?
Yeah, so what we've talked about so far, Ben, is one aspect of confirmation bias, which is I call biased interpretation. Once we get information, we interpret it in a biased manner. So if it's something we like, we immediately will accept it. If it's something we don't like, we will either not read it, or if we read it trying to pull it apart. But there's a second form of confirmation bias, which is, I think, just as important. It's bias search. Do we bother going out and looking for different viewpoints? And this even affects things like Google searches. So if I wanted an excuse to drink loads of red wine this evening, I could search for why red wine is good for your health. I'm sure I'd find a ton of studies showing that red wine leads to longevity. Now, had I looked at the opposite, had I Googled why red wine is bad for your health, then I could have found some opposite studies. But because I framed the question in a particular way, I'm only going to get a particular answer. And this applies much more widely than just Google searches. It applies to what newspapers we might subscribe to or read. It applies to who we follow on social media, X or LinkedIn. We often will be in echo chambers. We're just looking for information that confirms our viewpoint. Sometimes bias search is even more serious, and that even if we don't explicitly say something, we will receive selective information. So what do I mean by this? So let's say you're a boss at work. Often people think, I will want to placate the boss. I will want to give information that he or she will agree with. So even if I say nothing to suggest that I'm biased, most people assume that you only want to see something which is confirming. So this is why, again, we need to be intentional and as a boss say, I would like you to challenge me and show me why I'm wrong. That is important to ensure that you see the other viewpoint. This actually happened to me yesterday. So yesterday I was teaching in class, and I always encourage students to challenge me. And there was a question I asked, and the student gave an answer, and I gave a counterpoint, a different viewpoint to that student. She actually hadn't taken my core class, so she hadn't known that I like to have debate and different viewpoints. And then she came up to me in the break and was like really worried. And she said, "Oh, I sent you an email just apologizing for having a different viewpoint from you and challenging you. I really would like your reference to a PhD program. I'd like to study a PhD." And I said, "There's absolutely nothing wrong with challenging me. Actually, if you want to do a PhD, I would like somebody with independent thought. but because she is from a culture where a professor is somebody who's infallible, who's an authority, it was actually not natural to her to know that she is able to challenge me. So that is something that perhaps I should have recognized myself, rather than assuming that everybody knows that I'm open to challenge. Maybe I should have made that more explicit at the start, particularly for people who hadn't taken my core class.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. Something that I've noticed, and I have no data to support this, but just my intuition is that the Google search example has become even worse with generative AI, like with ChatGPT.
This is actually fair. So you people always think, well, isn't AI the solution to this because AI is unbiased, it's going to look at for everything out there. But I have used AI myself, and I've used it just to do research. I haven't deliberately tried to skew it one way, but when I ask, what is the evidence that diversity improves performance? Why? Because I'm doing a study on diversity myself. It comes up with some very flimsy studies by consultancies suggesting the evidence is unambiguous. And then when I write back to it, I say, none of these studies were published in top scientific journals. Can you give me the scientific research? It finds completely the opposite, and it admits it made a mistake. But had I not sent that follow-up challenge, had I been somebody who wants to believe that diversity pays off, I would have accepted the first thing uncritically. So even something like generative AI, I don't know how the algorithm is programmed, whether it's programmed to make it you like it and want to continue interacting with it. And if that is something as part of the algorithm to keep you there, then it will give you stuff that you want to be true.
Hmm. Yeah. How does someone's level of knowledge affect their susceptibility to confirmation bias?
So what you would hope, or you might think, is the more knowledgeable you are, the less susceptible you are to confirmation bias because you're able to think more rationally. You know the difference between correlation and causation. But the issue here is not the lack of knowledge, but it's the inability or unwillingness to use your knowledge because of your biases. And for that reason, actually, knowledge doesn't help because the reason why we're not interpreting information correctly is not through lack of knowledge, but our biases. In fact, actually, knowledge can make things worse. Why? If we see something we don't want to be true, the more knowledgeable people can come up with some reason to dismiss this. And one very salient example was Deepwater Horizon. So this was the explosion of one of BP's leased rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. And so what happened was you need to do a test known as a negative pressure test to check that the oil rig is safe before removing it. And they did the test at 3 times, and this always failed. And they came up with an explanation called the bladder effect, which is pretty technical. I describe it more in the book, as a reason for why this test was giving the wrong result. Because in their eyes, the rig was safe, so they should remove it. And so they came up with an excuse to do a different test. That test passed, and then the explosion happened. And afterwards, there was an official investigation into Deepwater Horizon, which found that this bladder effect was a complete fiction. Nobody in their right mind would have come up with that as an excuse for the failed test. But if you're really smart, then you might convince yourself by coming up with something convoluted.
Yeah, that's a crazy example. What role does black and white thinking play in making the truth elusive?
So far we've focused on one bias, which is confirmation bias, and that applies when we have a pre-existing view. We latch onto stuff that confirms that view and we reject stuff that contradicts it. But what happens if we don't have a pre-existing view? There might be certain topics that we're neutral on, and this is indeed where black and white thinking comes into play, which means that even if we don't have a pre-existing view, we have a tendency to see things in black and white terms. Something could either be always good or always bad. We have a binary opinion. So one example might be food. So with protein, most people do have a view. Protein sounds good, it builds muscle. With fats, most people think fat makes you fat. That's why it's called fat. But with carbs, most people may well be neutral. But the Atkins diet, it preyed on black and white thinking by suggesting carbs are always bad in all measures and all types of carbs, not just complex carbs, but simple carbs as well, and so on. And so, why was that such a successful diet despite extremely weak scientific evidence? It played on black and white thinking. It was really easy to follow. You don't need to track your calories and make sure that carbs are no greater than 30% of your daily calories. You just said, let me avoid carbs. And this was all carbs. It wasn't just refined sugar, it was complex carbs as well. But notice, had Atkins had completely the opposite diet, which is eat as many carbs as possible, he may well have been just as successful because that's just as easy to follow and it plays into black and white thinking. We see the same idea with some superfoods right now. So what this means is to pen a bestseller, Atkins did not need to be right, he just needed to be extreme.
Yeah, the way you tell that story in the book is very well told, but it's also very scary. Yeah. What are the problems that can arise from black and white thinking?
I think it means that we just ignore the nuances and shades of grey. We think that something is always good or always bad, when even if something is good, then it could still be good only up to a point. And one quite salient example is some people might die because of black and white thinking. So when you run a marathon, people tell you you need to hydrate as little and often, but drink as often as possible. And there have been marathon runners who've died from water intoxication where they drink so much that essential minerals are diluted to fatal levels. So even though water is good, it's not always the case that more is always better. It's the same as true with management practices. You might think, oh, let's give employees more autonomy, which seems to make sense. We want to delegate, but too much autonomy might mean that they're not coordinating their efforts. They don't have direction. Simply providing employees feedback is said to be a good thing, but too much feedback too often will lead to short-termism rather than focusing on long-term goals.
Hmm. So basically, there's a lot of gray in the world, which makes black and white thinking pretty challenging.
And what I try to do is that people might think, oh yes, I knew that there were shades of grey. I didn't need the book to do this. But when I talk about shades of grey may come in many different forms. So one form that we just talked about is the idea that more might not always be better, or less might not always be worse, and so on. But another type of shades of grey is even if something is good in general, not everything within that umbrella may well be good. So let's say if sustainability is generally good for financial performance, not everything under the sustainable bucket may be good. So let's say employee welfare is good for performance, which makes sense because it leads to motivated workers. But having a Catholic values screen might not be positively correlated with financial performance. But if we view the world in black and white terms, then anything which is called sustainable, we think is good. Similarly, anything which is called cholesterol might be bad when actually there is good cholesterol and there's bad cholesterol. But another form of black and white thinking is we see the world in labels and we treat everything under that label the same.
Hmm.